Today, I am very, very happy to have with us Mel Cappe. Mel Cappe is one of my all-time favorite people, a dear friend of mine. Mel Cappe has been many things in the policy world. His current position is as a professor at a little-known university and policy school named the Monk School at the University of Toronto. And he will tell you that the only reason that he is affiliated with that institution is that when he started teaching, the Max Bell School wasn't yet in existence. He may or may not agree with that. Before he was at the Monk School, he ran the Institute for Research on Public Policy. Before that, he was Canada's High Commissioner in the UK. Before that, he was the clerk of the Privy Council in Ottawa. I think before that, he was the Deputy Minister of Environment and maybe one other ministry. But he has been at or near the center of decision-making in Ottawa for a long time, and he knows a tremendous amount about how that machine works. And today we have Mel here to talk about managing a crisis, and he will explain the title, I Am in Control. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Mel Cappe. Thank you, Mel.
Thanks, Chris. Pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to be at the Max Bell School of Public Policy. So look, I am broadcasting to you from the Studio 3 of the CBC headquarters. It's the Cappe Broadcasting Center headquarters. And yes, I'm in control. The point of that title is to hearken back to 1981, and President Reagan is shot, rushed to a hospital. Vice President George H.W. Bush is in an airplane somewhere between Texas and Washington. Alexander Haig is the Secretary of State, and he goes to the White House and calls an immediate press conference and says, I am in control here. That was wrong, because actually when the president and vice president are incapacitated, the Speaker of the House is the next in line. But he was understanding that as a nuclear power, the United States had to demonstrate that someone was in control. And that's why it is important for us to keep in mind that somebody has to be in control. And I'll come back to this in just a minute. I'm going to go for as long as I can in order to avoid questions. And we'll see if I can use up an hour or not. So let me go to a bunch of lessons learned. And my first lesson is, and I think you should all keep this in mind, that there is genuinely a playbook for this. When you're caught in a crisis, it feels like everything is new. It feels like nobody has ever lived this before. But in fact, there are some principles you can use, and we'll talk about them today. And those principles can be very helpful in guiding you on how to perform and what to do. And so remember that others have done this before. Sometimes it's been more serious, sometimes less severe. But make sure that you learn those lessons. And there's nothing you'll hear from me today that is really new, but you do have to do what Nike tells you to do. Just do it. And you have to get on with it, and you can't overthink it. But when you need a playbook, it is there. And if it isn't, and if you're not in a crisis, write the playbook. So the first point is, remember that there are some principles you can use. The second point is, and that's back to the title, I'm in control, ensure that someone is in charge. Ensure that somebody is in control. And we see that now in a number of different circumstances. And if you look at the United Kingdom, which I follow closely, when Boris Johnson was admitted to the intensive care unit, immediately Dominic Raab took the podium and said, I'm in control. And again, the United Kingdom is a nuclear power with nuclear warheads, Trident warheads and submarines all across the world. And he needed to demonstrate that, yes, the Prime Minister is in intensive care, but somebody is in control. So be in control. Know who is in control. And know who does what, and make sure you do it. I'll tell you some stories about my experiences, including in particular 9/11, when these principles were established in my mind. but everyone needs to know what their job is, and everyone needs to do their job. The second factor in this is to keep in mind that there are 4 phases in a crisis. The first phase, and really the most important phase of a crisis, is the pre-crisis phase. Before there's a crisis, that's the time to prepare. That's the time to get ready, and there's no substitute for planning for the crisis. We know it will come. I mean, there's a lot of work, I'm sure that you at the Max Bell talk about long tail events and black swan events. And while we don't know what the black swan event is going to be, we know that there will be a black swan event. And it's for that reason that you have to plan, and you plan for the crisis. And recognize that then the acute phase is when you have to manage through the crisis. And in so doing, keep in mind that what you're going to do is have an effect on the recovery phase. And most importantly, what you do in the acute phase will have a huge impact on the long run. And it's important to keep your eyes on over the horizon to think about what's going to happen in the long run. So think of what Justin Trudeau has announced, Prime Minister Trudeau's announced in terms of the EI system, changes in the CERB, the emergency revenue benefit, how today he's announced a new provision for students, for post-secondary education students. And this has been a patchwork. He's added a little bit to cover each of the issues. He didn't actually set it up in a way that could, right from the beginning, solve all the problems in the long run. And he could have set up essentially a universal a UBI, a universal basic income, or he could have set up a basic income guarantee, but he didn't. And he patchworked on existing programs and policies, and that'll have an effect in the recovery, and it will have an effect in the long run. So keep in mind all of those things. The fourth item of this is situational dynamics matter. So 9/11, on September 11th, 2001, I'm in my office. I'm having a meeting with Jim Carr, who at the time was the president of the Manitoba Business Council. And we're talking about the government's relations with Western business. And it's 8:30 in the morning, and the door swings open. My executive assistant storms in and says, "You've got to come see this." I thought, Ariel, that's really rude. I mean, you don't storm into my office like this. And I go and watch his television and I say, "Good job, Ariel. That was the right thing to do." And from there, I go and call the Prime Minister. And I know the Prime Minister is in a meeting with the Premier of Saskatchewan, Lorne Calvert. And I speak to his executive assistant and I say, "Bruce, put me through to the Prime Minister immediately." Bruce Hartley knew that I didn't call wolf, that I didn't exercise that responsibility without the need for that to be there. And so he immediately put the Prime Minister on the line. And I was able to prepare him and tell him what was happening and tell him what we didn't know. But he was to get into an airplane and go down to meet with John Hamm, then Premier of Nova Scotia. And I said, "Prime Minister, you should definitely go. It's important to show that business continues." And he said, "No, this is too big. I need to be here. I need to show that someone is in control." And I was wrong. He was right. And it was exactly the right thing to do to stay there. You have to take into account these situational dynamics. You have to recognize that there will be some things working in your favor and some things working against you. Later that day, I spent all afternoon in my office with the Vice Chief of Defense Staff because the Minister of National Defense and the Chief of Defense Staff were in Sofia, Bulgaria at a NATO meeting. And the Vice Chief of Defense Staff was in control of the Canadian forces. And he and I were on the phone continuously. Well, he was in my office, but we were on the phone with the Commissioner of the RCM Police, the Prime Minister, and it was important to be able to have someone in control. But he had just come back from Colorado Springs as the deputy head of NORAD. And he knew everything there was to know about control of the airspace of North America. And guess what? We closed down the airspace of North America, and he was the right guy to have in my office. The next thing is that personalities matter. Mike Harris was the premier of Ontario at the time, and they were getting threats of anthrax in all the buildings of Queen's Park. And Prime Minister Chrétien and Mike Harris didn't talk. They had a terrible relationship. I happen to have a very good relationship with Andromache Karakatsanis, who was the Secretary to Cabinet. And Andromache, who now is on the Supreme Court of Canada, and I spent hours on the phone coordinating what Canada and Ontario could do together collaboratively. And we had built a relationship when there wasn't a crisis. And those personal relationships matter because it helps when you need them. And it's important to recognize, therefore, that personalities matter. And when you need them, you have to have built them. Don't try to build them in the middle of a crisis. Right now, we've seen Premier Ford and Premier Legault and a couple of other premiers, I would say all of them, have exercised strong leadership. Prime Minister Trudeau has a softer style, but he has exercised strong leadership as well. My sixth point is to mobilize your organization. You've got to use all the powers you have. You've got to use communications. You've got to delegate. I'll come back to some of these. But you need coherence in everything that you do. You have to recognize that you are changing the saddle on the horse while it's galloping. You're not in a calm period. Someone has to guide the horse. You have to look over the horizon. When I was the Deputy Minister of ESDC, or HRDC as it then was, we had to make sure in the ice storm in 1998 that the CPP and OAS checks went out, but we had to rejig the EI system to deal with the fallout from the ice storm. So you're dealing with the crisis of the ice storm, and we were doing this from the upstairs of the second floor above a Swiss chalet on Rideau Street, because the headquarters of HRDC had lost power, and we had to move. And we were managing the crisis from literally a Swiss chalet. The other thing you have to do is you have to build on and depend on these relationships. So there's a difference between the performance in SARS and the performance in COVID-19. In the SARS period, there was very bad blood between provinces and the federal government. And the coordination, and the then Deputy Minister of Health, Maurice Rosenberg, talked about how they didn't have as much cooperation. And one of the recommendations out of the Naylor Task Force doing the post-mortem on SARS was to improve that. And indeed, they did that. Exercise and plan. I've talked about planning already, but let me talk about exercising. Exercising means doing tabletop exercises or live exercises where you plan out what you would do, what anyone would do during a crisis. And I'll use the example of 9/11. In the summer of 2001, I was at 24 Sussex with the Prime Minister briefing on something. And he takes a phone call from the Chief of Defense Staff to be told that there is an invading aircraft coming in over the Pacific. And the Prime Minister comes back in the room and tells me, I just gave the order to shoot down the aircraft. It was an exercise. I knew what it was about because I knew what the exercise was about. I didn't know what the circumstances were, but this was the practice for the Prime Minister to learn his job, for me to learn my job, for the CDS to know how to ask the question, should we blow this plane out of the air or not? That played out in 9/11 when there was a KAL flight that went radio silent coming in from Seoul to LAX and intercepted over Alaska and redirected to Whitehorse. And we had to figure out whether to blow it out of the sky or not. And the Prime Minister had already practiced this. And the answer was no. If they will go to Whitehorse, we'll get the RCMP to meet them there. And that's what happened. So exercising matters. Maintain priorities. I've talked about looking over the horizon and thinking about the long run. You need to recognize that although you have to tend to the current acute phase of the crisis, that you also have to look over the horizon and think about the priorities that are going to come up to look after you, that you're going to preoccupy you afterwards. Stay in your lane, but show initiative. Everyone should know what their job is and be prepared to do their job, but you can do a lot of good by stealth. Let other people get credit. Nobody needs to tell Dr. Tam what her job is, the Chief Medical Officer in the Public Health Agency of Canada. But I'll bet nobody's ever heard of Tina Namiaskovsky. Tina's the president of the Public Health Agency of Canada. You haven't seen her because her job is not the public profile. It isn't to instill confidence. Her job is to manage the whole organization and the entire public health agency scope for Canada. But Dr. Tam has to be the chief public health officer. And so you've seen Patty Gladue, the minister, and you've seen Dr. Tam, but you haven't seen the president of the Public Health Agency of Canada. So know your job and do a good job. Finally, or not finally, I'm going to go to my final set of slides. The next one is provide analysis and evidence. This is the point about science, the role of science in managing this crisis. Some crises, it isn't about science, but it is about analysis and evidence. It's always going to be important. And when I was doing the ice storm at HRDC, we needed to know how the EI system was going to cover the people who were affected. And we had some of the best policy analysts in the government of Canada working on this, but we needed them. We needed them to do their job. And we needed the analytic capacity and the evidentiary capacity to make the right decision. When the border was closed in 9/11, we needed to know how long the wait was at each border crossing, and we needed huge amounts of data, and that was there. So, stay and show calm. This is a bit of a cliche, I suppose, but a chicken with its head cut off is not going to instill confidence. Leadership is having this balance of calm, of knowing when to be dominant and when to cede authority. Trump was trying to calm people down by denying reality, and that didn't work. But it was important for the president to get out there and calm people down. And now he's out there invoking the back to work people to be disruptive. That is not what a good leader would do. Delegate. Use the capacity that you've built up in the pre-crisis phase and use the people you've got. Move people in to add value. Get people to do things that are going to be value added. Recognize the importance of communications. Sometimes you're so preoccupied with doing the necessary that you forget that you've got to talk to the public and that the public needs to know. And one of the points about the need to know in intelligence is that you need to make sure the people who need to know. So communications internally, communications with your staff, communications externally. I'm the chair of the board of Canadian Blood Services. The CEO has been doing frequent bi-weekly podcasts and videos to all the staff to keep them informed on what we are doing in order to provide personal protective equipment and how we're managing COVID-19. Communications, there's no substitute. In that regard, you need to focus. It's really important that you remember what is important. You're going to be juggling a lot of things, and you need to be able to focus on what's important and déblayer le terrain, as they say, get the unimportant stuff out of the way. Look over the horizon. I've talked about this a bit. I think it's crucially important that people have a strategic focus as well as a tactical focus. Tactical, working in the acute phase; strategic, thinking about the recovery and beyond. You have to be engaged in both. And I've used the example of why, I think it's unfortunate the government didn't use this opportunity of a crisis, never let a crisis go to waste, of introducing a UBI to provide income support and income relief during the crisis, and then do an assessment afterwards and see whether that's a long-run solution or not. Don't wait to get it right. The perfect is unequivocally the enemy of the good. If you right now in a crisis, you have to get things done. And it's really important that you don't overthink things. You've gotten to positions of responsibility because of your training and your experience and who you are and your instincts and your nature. Use it. When Paul Martin was an outstanding finance minister, but he really did overthink things sometimes, and he would, during the Mexican peso crisis in 1999, the finance minister, I think it was actually 2000, wanted to get his statement right. And he worked on that statement all day. And by the time he got out, markets had closed. And while it was a brilliant statement, it was unheard when it was needed. So with the COVID-19 response of the government, I think the key thing is push the money out the door. Don't worry about whether you get it right. We'll clean up afterwards. You know, something's only important if it has an acronym, and there's FAG. FAG means fear of the Auditor General. If you have fear of the Auditor General, it can be paralyzing, and you won't do what you have to do. Number 18, go big or go home. And in the COVID-19 case, go big and stay home. But going big, sometimes I'm a big incrementalist. I'm a step-by-step kind of person. I think the solution to most things is to do them in a very measured fashion. And when you're in a crisis, you can't do that. You've got to go big. And I have an op-ed with Bob Ray in the Globe and Mail where that was our basic message to the government was get the money out the door, go big, do enough. Don't have to keep adding bits and pieces and patching and making it better. Get to the right answer in the first go. Incrementalism is not your friend in a crisis. We're getting to the end. Look after yourself and look after your people and their health. In a crisis, you're not going to get enough sleep. Your judgment is going to be impaired. Your people are going to give you bad advice if they're not getting enough sleep. You need to manage your and your staff's health, and you need to do it in a very selfish fashion. It is not helpful to work through the night if you're not going to be on the mark when it's time to actually deliver. So you don't realize how your judgment is impaired from lack of sleep or too much coffee. Look after your people and they'll look after you. Finally, just a comment on politics and policy. There's a clear relationship here, and when you're in a crisis, you're in the middle of it. What I want to emphasize here, and I'll use a little anecdote. When I told you before that I was wrong and Chrétien was right in the aftermath of 9/11, one of the things we were both wrong at was when it came time to go to New York City and visit the Twin Towers site. Jacques Chirac, the president of France, had been the first foreign leader on the site. And Chrétien and I discussed whether he should go or not, and we both agreed it was not a good thing. What happened when Chirac went? All of the recovery efforts on the site of 9/11 of the Twin Towers had to stop, and security paralyzed the city. So Chrétien felt that that was not going to be helpful for him to go visit the site. For over a week, the media tore him apart for not showing enough sympathy and empathy in going to New York City. Politics is part of this. Diplomacy, policy is part of it, and politics is part of it. And don't forget the politics of this.